It has a sorting hat select.
The
Do
official
you have to
J.K. Rowling
Do you have to
test.
fill out like a question? No, I'm good. Thanks.
All right, we'll call the meeting to order then. All right. Has everyone had a chance to look at the agenda? Do you have any requested changes? Hearing none, I'm gonna deem it approved by consensus. Comments from the chair. John Adams wasn't feeling well tonight, so he's going to miss our meeting. And I also want to just mention about scheduling. The next meeting would be on Christmas Eve, but I think maybe you discussed this at a meeting I didn't attend. I don't intend
You don't
to
plan
call
to
the
be here.
meeting for December 24th. Unless we have anything pressing that we need to have done before the new year and we can't accomplish tonight, then I think it's fine to skip the meeting. I would like to get the landscaping recommendations out today if we can. And if we can't, we should discuss at the end of the meeting whether we feel a sense of urgency to meet before the new year on a date other than Christmas Eve to do that. A short special meeting could accomplish that if needed, but I'm hopeful we don't have to do that. So assuming we don't need to do that, our next meeting will be on January 14th. I believe that calendar doesn't show 2019 yet, but
The 14th.
14th. So I just want to give everyone a heads up. This is our last meeting in 2018, and then we'll meet on January 14th, unless we decide otherwise. The other general business, or the other comments from the chair I wanted to mention is Eric Gilbertson from the Design Review Committee and Historic Preservation Commission reached out to me, said that they're working on a proposal for guidelines for changing the bylaws about the design review criteria. And so he asked to just have lunch with me and give me an update on where they are. I haven't had that yet, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a progress report from what I've heard. I've invited Kirby to attend the meeting with me, so anything I forget, Kirby can help keep track of. And I think that's it for my comments. So moving on to item 4, general business. This is where we invite members of the public who want to speak about something that's not on the agenda to offer comments. So I don't know if you have anything.
I'm here to talk about, I guess, the slopes and the landscaping, so which is both on the
Okay.
agenda.
Okay. All right. Do you want to just come introduce yourself and give us your general
Yeah, sure.
thoughts first, and then we can.
Just Anyways, my name's Will Shabaum. I live here in Montpelier, and general contractor. And I've been in front of you before speaking about the slope issue, and I came tonight just to see. My understanding is that you're sort of trying to fast track the slopes and the landscaping, and I see that as on the agenda. And I'm just curious what that, as far as an interim zoning thing, would that mean basically is like those will be adopted prior to all the other stuff that you're working on?
Yeah, we've identified those as 2 parts of the zoning bylaws as drafted that have proven administratively challenging. And so the idea is that we want to prevent as few future permit applications as possible from being impacted by some of those challenges. So if we can put forward a proposal to change the bylaws for the city council to review, then we want to do that as soon as possible.
Okay, well, that's great. I guess that was my reason I'm here is just like, is that happening? Is it, as a contractor, I've got a few people that are asking me, because then we have projects where it's like a small portion of it's touching 30% slope, and they're just kind of like, when can we do this? And I was like, well, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, it's the top item on
Yeah.
our agenda tonight and, in general right now.
So basically, you'll be voting tonight to send those.
Well, I can't
to-
guarantee anything,
Yeah.
but that's what we're hoping.
That's the hope.
We'll be able to
Okay,
vote
well.
tonight on the recommendation.
As a contractor and a member of the public, I say, if you can, that'd be great.
Do you have specific feedback for us to consider?
I think, I've spoken with Mike about, and I've seen the sort of draft, at least for the slopes, and I haven't perused through the landscaping stuff. That's a lot more involved, I think, and I think it all makes sense. And I agree that, yes, having development review board review anything over 30% and engineers, that makes perfect sense. Depending on size, and a lot of the projects that I deal with are very small scale. It's like a 600 square foot cottage that's on a small hill, or just an addition off the back that touches a hill. I'm not putting up condo units on Sibley Ave or something. So I think all in all, it's where you're headed is the right direction, and just wanted to see when it was going to happen and hear what you had to say about that.
Yeah, so even once we vote, it would just be a recommendation for city council that would then have to.
Then they would have to adopt it.
Yeah, and I believe they'd have to have a formal hearing process, so,
Yep.
Even if best
Yeah.
case scenario, we vote on something tonight, it could still be a couple of months.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
right,
Understand.
Mike?
So.
You're the expert.
Yeah,
on
best
this.
would be, best case scenario would probably be end of January.
Yeah. As far as when the potential to say apply for a permit under that interim zoning regulations would be.
Yes, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it could be end of January, early February.
That's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, my understanding is that once changes have been warned, then any new applications have to meet the modified laws, although they also have to meet the current laws, right, at the same time?
It makes a mess of things.
So it's best to avoid
State-
that.
state
Wait,
laws-
yeah, I've
state
been
laws
there
awful.
before where it's like right before the current regulations, and it was like, well, just wait until these ones are in place, because then you'd have to apply under two
Right.
statutes, and didn't want to do that. So, but yeah, so I just wanted to get a sense of like when I could sort of expect to let people know they could do their projects.
Yeah,
So.
we're doing the best we can.
Okay, alrighty. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
I
thank
may
you.
not
And
stick
if you
around
have other
for-
comments, just you raise your hand and we'll invite you back up.
Yeah,
so.
I probably won't stick around for too much longer, but I just
Understood.
wanted to get a sense from you and,
Yes.
put in my 2 cents. So, all right,
Great, thank you. All right, so item 5, we can jump right into the substantive discussion, reviewing the draft landscaping and screening standards.
So the version that I provided you tonight is has a couple places where there were changes made. So the first one, we had voted at the last meeting to take out on page 358, number 3, it's highlighted in yellow. I shortened that up. I let John Snell know that we were talking about this and what the recommendation was, that the tree board should adopt something, so he said he was gonna put it on their agenda for December and hopefully have it adopted in January. So it may just be a placeholder. But he is looking at the NTA 300s and not the best management practices. So I know Miss Abbott talked about potentially that they were, the recommendation from the creators of these is that it may be that the best management practices would be best, but it sounds like from John Snell that the tree board may be just looking to adopt the specific A300 standards, so.
And I pulled up A300 at our last meeting, and there are many categories. Most of it's not relevant to planting, so it really isn't a portion of these standards. And I think it's specific enough where it says plantings that it's not like we're trying to say that all of the standards apply. that we're specifying that it's only the planting
Yeah.
portions are pertinent?
Yep. Yes.
And so can you pull it up on a website? Because I'm
You can look at the
totally-
listings, but you can't look at the contents.
Right, so,
Yeah.
we're gonna have a copy at.
Yes. If we adopt
If-
these,
if
we
the
will
tree
have
board-
to have a copy
Yeah, okay.
downstairs.
So I guess what I pulled up was like the table of contents, which was like
Yeah.
11 different categories, and one of which was planting.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
but you can't
yeah.
see the, can we scan it and put it online? Probably not.
Not if it's
He
not-
ordered a copy, so I was contemplating whether I should order it, and then I figured I would go and see what their direction was before. I mean, they're relatively cheap. They're like $20 a copy. I think they weren't too bad.
So when people ask about this, will you be sending them to the tree board? Or just telling them you have a
It's-
copy and they can come look at it?
I think what it's going to end up being is we will have a copy, and depending on the project and depending on what it is, depends whether we would. A lot of times we have what are called TRC, technical review committees, and so when we have the TRCs, applicants come in and we invite everybody in. And I think if we had a project that was going to have a number of plantings, we would just have either Jeff Byer or somebody from the tree board be there to go and answer questions of the specifics of the plantings, if they're not already familiar. As we said, with the A300s, the advantage of those is a professional probably already knows those standards, so that's a little bit of the advantage is they can, at least from the engineering firms, when they're printing out their plans, they can just go and pull up the A300 tree planting.
Yes, here it is.
So that was the first one. I didn't delete it. I just put in a kind of a placeholder that reflected that. So the next set of changes were actually on 361, where we get to the total site landscaping, but just above that, which is number 7, and this appears twice. This is just for the nonconformities for screening. You'll notice highlighted 3%. Those did say 5%. And so what this says, where a site is nonconforming with respect to screening, the applicant shall be required to come into compliance unless the cost of compliance will exceed 3% of the total cost. The reason why I dropped that from 5% to 3% is I was actually looking at our zoning that was in effect from 2006 to 2018 that we just replaced, and that one actually had a cap of 3%. So we were trying to guess. I was like, well, some people do 2%, some people do as much as 5%. Well, actually, we used to do 3%, so I just thought I would pick that. We can certainly go back up to 5% if we wanted to, but if we wanted to be consistent with what we had been doing for the past 15 years in the past, it was
Right.
3%.
Do you have any knowledge as to why 3% was the standard previous?
A lot of, like I said, a lot of communities have these caps. It just really comes down to what do you do in the case where somebody is coming in to put in a $10,000 deck on the side of a restaurant to do some outdoor seating, and they have a lot of nonconformities. This just gives us an idea of how we can handle that. We know we want them to come into conformance, but with a $10,000 project, are we going to make them to do $10,000 worth of landscaping? They may not do the project at all. This just caps it at 3% to go through and say you're going to have to apply 3% of the project cost, whatever it is, to improving that nonconformity. So it will, over time, come into compliance if you're not.
And then
Project at a time.
who designates where that 3% goes in terms of how much they come into compliance?
In this case, it would depend on whether it's a major site plan or a minor site plan.
So it would just be a review
If it's a minor
process.
site plan, it would be the zoning administrator. If it's a major site plan, it would go to the development review board.
More bushes, less trees. I mean, basically, it's kind of a choice like that then.
Yeah, I mean, when you're looking at cost, it's really going to come down to, what is effectively, and this is really talking about screening. So
Yeah.
in a lot of cases, this is talking about somebody's building a deck, but they have a dumpster that was never screened. So we're gonna kinda know where it's gonna go, you're just gonna have to, you have to apply at least $300 towards that
Good.
requirement.
I don't know enough about what it costs to do landscaping. How much screening is $300 get you on the $10,000 deck?
Maybe not a ton, but it's, as we said, we're looking at a percentage of the cost that's gonna be going on top of that. You're gonna be able to get some work done for that, but like I said, it's just an overall cost.
I think landscaping is fairly expensive, isn't it?
I think it depends what you're,
I mean, I imagine you could get at least a couple of shrubs planted for $300.
Oh, yeah.
but a lot of
at least.
projects we get are, up to $100,000 worth of stuff. So, as I said, it could be, we can do whatever number that you'd like. The issue we have right now is we don't have any regulations to help us with nonconformities. So if somebody comes in with a deck and we're left with, I
They've gotta
guess,
come into compliance.
yeah, if you've got $50,000 worth of landscaping needs, you're gonna have to do 50,000. And so we just needed to have some way of regulating how we're gonna do it. This is a typical way of doing it, 3%, 5%. You can make whatever percentage number you want.
Do we want to set some minimum? I mean, a small project, but could have a significant nonconformance.
But what are the advantages and drawbacks of having a higher percentage set aside versus a lower percentage? I mean, so one would probably, having a lower percentage would mean that you could have more development or infill. Is that accurate? I don't feel like I understand this well enough to understand
So this one is
what the decision is.
Yeah, this one's looking at nonconformities from the standpoint of
Screening.
strictly with the screening, and I think Total Landscaping has a similar 3%, except they have an additional requirement which we will go over.
So maybe we should look at these all together and we can get through all the changes.
Yeah, so the 3%, so on the next page on 362, the same provision applies at top, except this one has an A, because we also need to address where a site is non-conforming with respect to impervious cover, the applicant demonstrates that that as a result of the nonconformity, the site cannot reasonably meet the total landscaping requirement. The Development Review Board may waive some or all the total landscaping requirements. So this just puts a second out in there because we have sites that you might be in urban center too, and I can think of a couple of them that are 100% impervious. And therefore, you're gonna come in, you're gonna have to do a project, we're gonna say you gotta do 5%, 3%, whatever the number is, and they're gonna look out and say, I have no percent. I don't have any landscaping place I can put. So either I'm gonna have to tear up or tear down buildings, or I'm gonna need a waiver. So this just gives an out for the Development Review Board to waive some or all the landscaping requirements based on the fact that there's just no place to put it. But other than that, the percentage amount of money to spend is still tends to be in there. And I think both of these, whether it's for the screening or whether it's for the total landscaping, would probably have the same percentage.
So, in the tax world, because when we're talking about like a chilling effect of something, like there's a lot of studies out there showing like a modest sales tax, like 6%, doesn't really have much of a chilling effect. It's like there's like a lot of research out there on that, and that's kind of how I'm thinking of this. It's like 3%, 5% was the increased the 5%'s higher. Would that have a chilling effect on projects? And yeah, I think of it as similar as like a sales tax. I don't really think it necessarily would have a chilling effect. That's my point of view.
Yeah, I mean, probably not. I mean, in theory, you could go through and say that all nonconformities have to be erased. I mean, legally, we could just go through and say you've got to bring them, if you're going to get a permit, you got to come into compliance, but we get a lot of smaller projects, and somebody says, I'm going to put a new propane tank in. We're like, great, you got to put in $5,000 worth of landscaping.
Right,
Then we'll
right.
give you your permit
No,
for the
I
propane tank.
understand the need for it. I think we're all
Yeah.
convinced about that. It's just a matter of what percentage is appropriate. And my first thought was, oh, I don't want to discourage some of the development that we want to see in like the urban center where there's not a lot of screening or landscaping. But then on the other hand, we want to have development that is aesthetically pleasing and contributes to good design, and that's all part of it. So it does make sense to at least have some percentage set aside for this. I like that. Interesting what you're saying about the chilling effect. Barb, you look like you're ready.
No, I was just wondering, when you were saying that, are there other regulations, criteria that they have to meet other than landscape screening? You know, in terms of mechanicals outside a building?
So if what they are putting in is a new propane tank or new dumpster, they would have to screen that dumpster. This 3% doesn't let them out of that.
Okay.
This 3% is just, you're putting in something that's separate, a deck.
Mm-hmm.
And now the question comes in, we notice that you're also non-conforming with respect to your screening of your X. And the question is, do we make that happen?
But screening is not just restricted to landscaping.
No, it's not, which is why we don't worry about it. If it's 100% impervious, well, then you might have to put up a fence.
Okay.
So on the previous page, screening materials can be landscape buffers, but they can also be fences and walls. They can be berms. And those are the three options that you have for screening materials. And then what has to be screened are parking lots, utility service areas, and building mounted equipment.
Other thoughts?
And I'm comfortable with the 5%. I don't think that's that bad. I just thought I would point out the fact that previously we had 3% as a number.
It's good to know. It's just
We're adding something in. Currently we have nothing, and if we bring it in, there's a certain sales pitch you can give to go through and say, well, we're just going back to the way it was in that. But if we want to go beyond it, that's, as you said, I don't think the difference between $300 worth of landscaping or $500 worth of landscaping is really going to go and take somebody's deck project out.
what do folks think? The 3% or the 5%?
I guess I probably agree with Kirby. I do. I'm gonna say that more definitively.
So
what
increase
was
it
Kirby
to
saying?
Go to
something.
5?
I was- I mean-
5%.
I suggested that.
Yeah, I
that-
didn't think there was a
that
clear
I don't
recommendation.
think that, yeah.
yes, let me
you go ahead, you
restate.
make the point.
I think after hearing Kirby's valuable contribution, I think 5% does not seem like a too harsh a hurdle to put in, and landscaping seems like even if it's $200 worth, more landscaping seems like a positive thing. So that's my take on it at this point.
Aaron, comfortable with that?
I just have a quick question. Like you were saying, I mean, can you kind of give me just a ballpark? Like, what's the range in terms of the price of these projects that we're talking about? I mean, clearly there's like a $10,000 deck, but is that the norm? Are we talking?
Most of our permits, we get a couple hundred permits a year.
Mm-hmm.
So most of them are going to be relatively small permits for changing windows in the historic district or, a lot of smaller projects in those areas. And then from there, it ramps up to, $5 million for French block and, some of these bigger projects. But some of them are going to be exempt because of being in Urban Center 1 or whatever, but most of those big projects are already covering themselves on different points.
Okay.
So it's really how we handle the small ones.
Yeah, I just feel like if there's not a lot of difference on the margins in terms of the small projects, which it sounds like it is, and the larger ones are going to be covered with different areas anyway, and this isn't going to really touch those bigger projects so much. 5% is probably fine. But frankly, I mean, this is sort of my first blush at it, so I don't purport to be.
We just,
Yeah,
we,
yeah, right.
even us, we
Yeah.
make this, we put
Yeah.
the other, this is fixing the previous proposal because
Yeah.
we hadn't even thought of this until
Yeah.
we started doing them,
Yeah.
and
So it sounds like there's a consensus for 5% for screening and total landscaping, total site landscaping.
I was given one question this afternoon related to that on, is there a project that is just too small? Should we have a minimum project?
Right, that's what Barb said.
I was thinking more on from the other side, though, a minimum amount for landscaping.
Yeah, you were thinking minimum amount for
Oh, you were.
landscaping,
Like a floor.
and the other one is,
Yeah,
the
the
other
other one
side
is
is
the
if somebody's doing a $750 project, are we requiring, I don't even think that would be $75, $7.50
Yeah,
worth
right.
of landscaping.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a floor to some of these where we just go and say, look, if landscaping is less than this, there's two options. One would be if it's less than this, you have to at least do X amount, which I think was what Barb was
Yeah.
thinking. Or the other option is if it's less than this amount, we're not gonna ask you to do landscaping if the landscaping requirement is under a certain amount.
Well, what's an example of a $750 project that would be none? Or
We'll get small projects that might come in. I mean, certain changes of use might just need a sign. Might just be a sign permit that'll come through. There's really no other changes, and so we're left with what does that mean?
Plant some flowers around the sign.
You don't wanna screen your sign by nature of it being a sign.
But you could screen the base of the sign, yeah.
For
But
$7, I mean, that's pretty,
it's,
it's not a big flower.
right, it's a small pot.
Plant some
And
seeds.
that doesn't even put it in the ground. That's
Yeah.
It's just purchasing
Yeah,
it.
yeah, right.
I think I'm comfortable with an exemption for small projects, but I don't know what everyone else is feeling.
Seems like it's a de facto exemption where it's such a de minimis amount on those small projects that, I mean, Mike, you're not going out in the field and enforcing, right? So,
I mean, technically, we really shouldn't be writing rules that we have no intentions of, going and saying, well, we'll just ignore that because I'm not going to be enforcing that. So, I mean, but we should
But
just
Mike-
put a de minimis where the landscaping requirement is less than $100, or
50?
I was thinking 300. I mean, I think the only hesitation I have with any of these numbers is that I don't have a good sense of, what it costs for a landscape professional just to even come out and sort of assess. I would assume I just don't know what $100 gets you.
Right,
I
so if
think
you
that's-
look
I think
at
that was-
$100 and you need to plant something and you need to follow the NCA 300 standards,
Right.
and you're just one person that doesn't,
Yeah.
right, you can't hire someone to do it.
Right, it's sort of, there's some, I'm thinking it's probably gotta be in the $300 to $500 range before anybody even takes any of that seriously. Would be my guess, I just don't know.
I mean, you could put a substantial amount of landscaping in one specific area for $300. 6 bushes, small, enough to shield something. So if,
Yeah.
if we want to set a minimum, I think it's going to have to be small.
the point I was getting at is like, I don't think Mike's gonna be out there and say, that bush only is worth $80, not $100. That kind of thing, where,
usually that we're going to get that in the application stage.
Yeah.
People are going to come in and go and say, what are you going to do? And we're going to
Yeah.
come in and say, you need to be doing something. What are you going to be doing for this amount?
and so if we don't have a de minimis exemption, then people will say, well, $7, I'm gonna buy a plant.
But then you have to plant it following the NCA 300. That's part of it.
Yeah.
If it's such a
And it
small
has to be
thing-
replaced if it dies, because that's a requirement
Yeah.
under any landscaping
Oh.
requirement. So
Right.
you're
You give them the book, and
So
they'll have
let's
to
do
look.
a
Small
de
amount of money,
minimis
really.
waiver for what, less than $100?
$100, I guess,
Is
yeah.
that?
at least it's a number, and if it comes back that it's not high enough, we can always come back and go and say, look, we're getting a bunch of these that are just silly, and then we can always come back. But at least $100 gives us something. There's something there.
All right, everyone comfortable with that?
All right.
What else is new?
So, the next, so as we get into the total site landscaping, I made a few tweaks to the administrative rules.
Sorry, where are you?
Where are you?
Still, it's the same page, 361.
3203.j.
Yep, now we're into .j, the last of the total site
Where we
landscaping.
got stuck?
Where we got stuck last time. So we had some questions that came up. Previously, this had been talking about forested areas, and we had some discussion about whether we should or shouldn't be regulating forested areas. So I tried to do a little bit more massaging on this one, and the riparian rules talk about naturally wooded vegetation. So rather than create a new term of art, I just grabbed the old one and replaced it to make this one say, so this is for calculating planting area, where an applicant demonstrates that naturally wooded vegetation is on the parcel, is proximate to the development site, and furthers the purposes outlined in section 3203.a. So that's the purposes of this section. The naturally wooded vegetation may count towards landscaping requirement on a 2-to-1 basis. For example, retaining 2 square feet of naturally forested cover or riparian habitat will count towards 1 square foot of landscaped area. So this puts the burden onto the applicant that they would have to demonstrate that it is on their parcel, is proximate to the development site, because some of these development sites can be rather big, and we don't want somebody counting something that's clearly the purposes of the landscaping requirement is to improve the aesthetics and to screen bad things and blah, blah, blah. There are 4 requirements. Well, if it's up on the back of the hill, it's not going to do any of those 4 things. So this kind of gives a little bit of room for us to count that, but at the same time, they don't just automatically get credit for everything. Perennial plantings may be used.
Hold on.
Okay.
So the point you're making there, where there's some discretion, administrative discretion,
Mm-hmm.
you're packing all that into the may that's there, right? Is that something we should make a little more explicit?
Well, and the is proximate to the development site is arbitrary to some degree.
It's,
right?
yeah, it's a
Whether
little
proximate
bit,
to the development site or not is up to interpretation.
if we think we know how we could grapple and wrap that in, I mean, we talk about proximate with other accessory structures and some other things. I mean, there'll be a certain amount of gray when it's the administrative officer making that call, but I think it could also be appealed to the DRB if somebody believes the administrative officer has said that's not proximate, and great, you can appeal it to the DRB. And
It's just, yeah, if you think that your office will exercise discretion on this may, then I think maybe we should have a standard to apply. But if you don't think that in practice you'll end up doing that, then it's fine the way.
well, I
it
guess if
is.
the applicant demonstrates, I guess the key is that should probably say shall. If we're looking at that may that's later in there, purpose outlined in section 3, the woody vegetation shall be counted. Because the assumption being that if the applicant demonstrates it, the administrative officer and the DRB always has to make the determination of whether or not it has been demonstrated. If you demonstrate it's proximate, if you demonstrate it's on your parcel, and if you demonstrate it meets these 4 purpose statements, we can count it on a 2-to-1 basis. And if we don't, it's because we're saying it's not. Think that covers it?
So is proximate to the development site, I'm just wondering, I mean, do we have a range? Or, I mean, Stephanie's point is well taken, that it's a little bit vague, so.
It's a little bit vague, but I think if you're looking at that proximate in relation to the purpose statement, because you have to meet all of them, so it's proximate, but it has to enhance the appearance of the built environment as viewed from a public vantage point, create shade along sidewalks, walkways, parking lots, provide landscape buffer between residential, non-residential uses, screening uses, and development that creates, that screen the land uses and development that create visual clutter and distraction. So I think if you kind of know what the purpose is,
So maybe we could change it
Or maybe the
to-
proximate doesn't have to be there at all, if you can meet these 4 requirements.
Yeah. I mean, you could say is proximate to the development site so that it furthers the purposes, or something like that. But, yeah, maybe we could just take it out.
Take out the proximate.
Yeah,
If you look at 3203A,
yeah.
yeah, if it's remote from the site, then yeah,
It's
you'd
gonna
have,
be
you
difficult
wouldn't
to
be able
meet
to
one
meet
of those
those.
4 requirements.
Yeah.
Like
I mean,
said.
how big a project, a site are we talking about? I mean, if we have a several acre site, it's possible that they could meet these criteria and still not have it be close to the building.
Well, it's the
where they're-
development, yes, the development site that, which can be,
The site or the site of the development.
yeah, we had this discussion of whether or not we wanted to define site, because we talk about site plans, we talk about
Yeah.
sites, and sites and parcels tend to be the same when they're small. I mean, you
Yeah,
have a quarter
yeah.
acre site, it pretty much is the whole entire parcel. The question is, at what point should we have a different definition for site when it's something that's less than the size of the parcel? And that was a question that administratively downstairs we had been kind of chewing on a little bit to try to come up with, should we have a separate definition of site?
I mean, thinking about the distillery project, you know, if there was a landscaped area at one far end of the project, I mean, is it possible that it could potentially meet these 4 criteria and still not be proximate to the disturbed area? I don't know.
I'm
Yeah, and I
comfortable
think
leaving
that's-
it in here. I think that, I'm fine with leaving it in here. I think it's gonna be
Yeah.
got called to some degree. If it's a 9 acre parcel and they're doing a little bit of work over here and they're trying to count something away on the other side, I think there's a, gonna
Yeah, and
depend on the
I think there would be a good
Approximate
one. Think of
helps.
timber frame, a 9 acre parcel.
right.
And there's riparian buffer on the river on the back of this 9 acre parcel. All their work is being done up by Route 12. Can they count that riparian buffer on the river at the back of the 9 acres towards their landscaping requirement? And my thought was,
It's
well, it's
not
not really
proximate.
proximate to the
Right.
project. The project is in the front 3
Right.
acres. But it's on the parcel, and so that was where I was that was the one that was kind of rolling around in my head.
So if we left proximate on, in there, that would at least give you a basis.
It would give us a basis to say no in certain cases where somebody wants to count, you know.
I'm okay with that.
So I just, I don't mean to be contrarian, but I just disagree with that. I don't see that the proximate verbiage is needed, because you have the purposes outlined in 3203. If the woody natural vegetation is not proximate to the built environment, it's not going to be able to enhance the appearance of the built environment, which is the first prong of 3203A. It won't be able to create shade along sidewalks and walkways. It won't be able to do the things that 3203A is aimed at doing. And I just feel like if I'm the review board, if I'm weighing an applicant's demonstration of fulfilling those requirements, and then you add an undefined term such as proximate to the development without any standard for me to evaluate that, it just creates another level of uncertainty where I feel like if, the board is going to be given discretion to determine whether or not those 3203A purposes are met by the application, I think it should just be enough, but I just don't know what a undefined term of proximate to the development site adds to that.
The only case I can think of where something might not be proximate to the site, but actually fulfill 3203 is number 3 there, where it says providing a buffer between residential, non-residential, which arguably the timber homes, natural vegetation's a buffer between that and the development in the river. So you could say that it meets A3 here, but maybe still isn't proximate enough.
Sure, and I think that's, again, I think that's a call that the board can make if an applicant tries to make that demonstration. They can make
Yeah.
that call. I think that the proximate question just adds another variable that kind of muddles the analysis, but that's just me. I can see the other side of the coin too, don't get me wrong, but I feel like the 3203A standards give at least some quantifiable and objective standard by which the board can evaluate an applicant's demonstration of a, counting the land, counting the woody areas.
I could go either way.
I
mean,
could go
was
either
a
way.
proponent of getting rid of proximity as part of it.
So what do we
I-
got?
I'm either way there,
Yeah,
but.
my initial point, and sorry for bringing this up and getting us into the weeds on this, was really that I think if you keep proximate in there, there's a possibly, if you make a decision based on the proximate language, you could end up getting into some legal trouble with it. I don't feel that
But then they can
strongly
apply to
either.
DRB, right?
They can
So-
call the DRB, the
Yeah,
DRB
but the
can make the
DRB
decision, and
And they're the ones who make the decision ultimately, so.
They could also get in legal trouble.
And they could also get into legal trouble trying to
Well,
interpret and apply
There's
approximately.
so many
and-
elements of interpretation.
Right.
But, you know,
Yeah.
Right, well, we're
So-
all
trying
of,
to minimize those.
you know, A1
And
through
we're not-
4 are interpretation elements.
Yeah,
you
that's,
know.
I think
Yeah.
that's probably enough for
So,
them to handle on.
So if we take out proximate, then we take out the possibility that there's all these arguments about it that we don't intend to ever happen. Or leave it and see what happens.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, 'cause I guess that same argument could be used for the purpose, the elements raised in the purpose as well, so, it's definitely a matter of interpretation.
What's easier for your staff when looking at it?
I mean, clearly from the decision-making standpoint, if we don't have to make that determination of whether it's proximate, then that's one less decision we have to make.
Okay.
I was just, if we find we get ourselves caught in a position where we're approving things that we don't want to because we don't have that, we can always come back and either define that term or, as we said, we're improving something that doesn't exist. So anything is an improvement over what we have, and I think, like I said, I was just trying to capture a little bit of those projects where people come in with the big, I know of some Malone properties on Gallison Hill that they've got, a big industrial building up front, and then they own another 15 acres of woods in back. And I know the question is going to come up of, well, doesn't that just meet all my landscaping requirements? It's like, well, but I guess now we've got the basis in there. Well, if you can demonstrate 3203A is met, then sure,
Yeah.
you can
Alright.
count that.
But do we want them to count that? I mean, is that the ultimate result that we want to see happen?
Well, the purpose of our landscaping standards are to implement those 4 standards. So all of these standards that we've been reviewing are to achieve those 4 things. If there's a 5th thing we should be adding, then I guess that would be the next question.
Well, no, I mean, I guess it seems like it's splitting hairs, that potentially they could argue that it meets those 4 criteria, but it's still halfway across, it's still an acre away from where they're developing. So do we want the landscape standards to apply to the area that is being developed?
Well, of course, and I think that the argument isn't about whether we want those to apply or not. The argument is about whether this achieves it with or without the term proximate.
Yeah, and I guess I can think of all kinds of different ways to get around it, so that's.
But if it's a 9-acre parcel and it's all on the back acre, is it enhancing the appearance of the built environment as viewed from the public vantage point?
Right.
Well, maybe the public
I
I
vantage
mean,
point.
it may be, if you think about the State House, it may be yes, because that back hill is all forested and acts as a forested
Right.
screen for the back, if
Well,
it
I
happens to
think
be
anyone would
flat.
call that development clutter.
Yeah, but it's whether it's meeting, when it comes to the next one, where we're talking about the total landscaping requirement.
I think for a
Alright.
lot of them, they're not gonna meet that first one.
All right, so without taking an official vote on this, raise your hand, how many people want to strike the proximate aspect of this?
I mean, I guess it'd be fine, yeah.
All
And
right.
how many people want to keep it? 2 people want to keep it?
No, I'm just like, I'm not sure, to be honest.
Doing
so.
bad, it's doing-
I think I
Alright.
talked myself into, we can cover it without that.
All right,
All right, Barb, do
goes down.
you want an official vote to
No, I don't care.
document the dissent?
Really. But
Okay.
I do, I do have to say that I constantly think about these in different ways that I could get around them
That's
in
good.
Oh.
terms
I
of
like that.
site design.
That's helpful.
So it's sort of like, oh, yeah, I could easily do this and the, the natural area would be half a mile away. But, anyway,
Yeah, we'll
We don't
look
want
and
that
see
to
how
happen.
we'll look and see how it plays out
yeah.
in the
real life.
reality. And sometimes we just have to see how the DRB comes down on a couple of these, because if the DRB starts being very consistent in, no, we're not going to count that for X, Y, and Z, or we'll count only a portion in the front of it, because yes, these first 50 feet are actually making a nice backdrop to the restaurant or whatever, but the last 750 feet of it are not providing any benefit, and therefore we're not going to give you any credit for those. But we'll see where the DRB plays it.
Okay, so here's the change I see is proximate to the development site is gonna be struck.
Yes.
And then, may is gonna be changed to shall.
Yeah. Although I'd be curious to see where some of the other DRB ones are, but we'll make those.
What's that?
Oh, I was just trying to think about, occasionally it's written where the DRB may approve where the applicant demonstrates. I don't think, but I'll put it as shall, because I think actually if the applicant demonstrates it, I think legally, if the applicant does demonstrate it, we are kind of obliged to give
But the
them
decision
that.
of whether they've adequately
Demonstrated that is
yeah.
up to the others. So B, moving us quickly into the next one, B actually is just moved up from later on. I noticed that we talk about perennial plantings, and then we have these administrative rules up top, and it really should have been part of these administrative rules. So perennial plantings, when it comes to total landscaping, if you're planting perennials, they can be counted on a 1 square foot basis. And then C, I added in, because we've had a number of these questions that have come up, and I think this will help clean some of this stuff too. To be counted as an existing tree or shrub for the purposes of this subsection, trees and shrubs must be healthy and have suitable planting area to support its long-term viability. Unmanaged or unmaintained portions of a site shall not count as landscaping unless the area meets the provisions of 3203J1, which we just talked about. Invasive species shall never be counted towards total landscaping. So the purpose of this is we have had people who've come in with applications, and you'll have a tree growing sideways out of the foundation and then kind of turn and kind of grow up, and they're like, well, I got a tree. That counts as my tree. And we're like, well, yeah, it is a tree, but, or it's just brambles with a bunch of junk in there, and you're just like, should that really be counting towards our existing landscaping if it's not really landscaped? And if you drive and look around, you can see between buildings on Berry Street and different things, you'll go and see that just in between the buildings is just grown up scrub. And does that really count as counting these things out and go through and say, I found 7 maples in there, so.
If nothing else, maybe it would encourage
sense.
people to maintain them, the ones that
Oh,
are
yeah.
there.
So
you
that's
know,
the point,
so-
was we would be able to at least, if we go and say, if you want to count it as existing, do something to kind of make it qualify.
thought
We aren't obligated to take your tree as a tree.
My other thought is with ash borer, in a few years, we're gonna have trees that are not healthy. That
Yep.
are not gonna count anymore.
Ash borers or another common
And
tree.
that's gonna get people to actually replace those trees, which might be a good thing.
Yeah, trees of paradise.
I have
There are a
a
couple of other trees. That are
sorry, I have a quick note
Yep.
about 3203J1C. Quick question. The second to last sentence, unmanaged or unmaintained portions of the site shall not count as landscaping. And the last sentence is invasive species shall never be counted. Why is there different verbiage? If one is shall not count as landscaping, the other one is shall never be counted towards total landscaping. Is there a reason why there's
probably should say not.
Just shall not count towards.
Be counted towards.
Sorry,
landscaping.
I
It's
just-
being, yes.
I'm just.
I was being overly,
Sorry.
We lost a couple lawyers, so we needed to get
Sorry,
one back.
sorry.
Yeah.
I just know.
In
I
in
won't-
relationship to that, Mike, so then the owner needs to go into their area and determine if they're invasive species within a forested area?
no, not, I mean, if they're going for the forested area, this is just for a site. And we'll get a number of them that will come in, that are just, even some of these Berry Street, Elm Street projects that, it's just a small 20,000 square foot lot, and there's just a section of something that's in brambles, and this is questions whether they can count those as trees.
So
But
they have
as
a-
they start mapping them out to go and tell us, we're gonna ask them, do you meet your tree requirement? And if they go through and say, yeah, I've got a tree here, I've got a tree here, and I've got 2 trees over here, and we can go and ask them what are they?
Okay.
Because first of all, we need to know, because we have to determine is this a large tree, medium tree, or a
Right.
small tree? And if they go and tell us, well, that's a X tree, we can go through, we can look, because we've got the list, or know that,
And-
well, a tree of paradise is an invasive species and therefore doesn't count.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have a lot of invasives, but, so we have a clear designation of a list of invasive species that they can reference
The
in the
state does.
zoning.
The state, and it's referenced in
It's
here.
okay, so the state list is referenced in the
Yep.
zoning.
And this doesn't apply to the natural woody vegetation. That's when this is when you're specifically counting exact
What-
trees. So if you have
what's
invasives in
existing.
your natural woody
Yep.
area, you're
Yeah,
not gonna, this
yeah.
doesn't apply to that.
Go and survey your 2 acres of wooded site.
Yeah.
Wow.
Hoping we can get through this in 5 more minutes, so we have an hour to talk about slopes.
All right.
'Cause we're gonna need it.
Oh, no.
So just skipping to the bottom of that, you'll see number 4. We already talked about this previously, so I will make the changes that we approved,
The percentage.
the percentage and the wording of anything else. So we'll make those. So the last thing that comes up is back up on number 2, which was what we left at. There used to be a 2 and a 3.
Yep.
And the 2 talked about lots less than 1 acre, 3 talked about lots more. And John made comments that were absolutely correct. It really wasn't, I didn't have it right. I made mistakes. And so I spent a lot of time, again, playing around with a bunch of more examples. And what I've put in here is a more complex one, but there are a number of ways of trying to get us to a number that works. But one possibility is to go back and move to a factor of, if we apply a factor of 0.033, which you see is the requirement just for the 90%, and if we just took that out and just said, look, we're just going to apply a factor of 0.033, it actually kind of works through all the districts. It does apply just a minimum, and you're looking at it as a minimum. It works at no matter what the size of the parcel is. And I ran this all the way out to projects like Tractor Supply, which is a 20,000 square foot building with a 20,000 square foot outdoor storage area with another 60,000 square feet of parking. That one didn't have enough landscaping, but I think all of us could go out there and go and say it didn't have enough landscaping. But the biggest thing it didn't have was landscaping enough shading for the parking. So if it simply met its parking shading requirement, it would meet the 0.03 requirement. The other thing I looked at was we all kind of thought the shading requirement worked okay, so I converted that to our new system of impervious cover. That comes out 0.042, so that's not too bad. You know, we're starting to see numbers all in the same area here of stuff that tends to work. The number that didn't work when I calculated out our current zoning, which has absurdly too much landscaping, which is why we're redoing these rules. It came out to 0.19, so you start seeing, okay, well now that's an upper limit, 0.19. We don't want to be up that high. So I played around with a lot of different examples, from Tractor Supply, Caledonia Spirits, and looking at some of them and kind of giving an eye to them as to whether or not they really could have, like Caledonia Spirits, I think we recognized could have had a little bit more landscaping. It would have been fairly easy to have provided more landscaping. And really started to come up with that the 0.033 would work as a across the board for any of them. Just get the impervious cover multiplied by 0.033. That's the amount of landscaping you could meet. In certain cases, it might be a little bit on the low side. So the other options, which you see here in number 2, the most complex way of doing this is we looked at, you have the building size, and you have your other impervious cover like parking lots. We already know the parking lot requirement gets up to 0.04, and that kind of works. So we could just go through and say structures have to meet this, and the other landscaping has to meet the other number. And this just goes and says the other parking lot would be 0.033. So if you've got a parking lot that's basically smaller than 10 parking spaces, you're at 0.033. As soon as you hit 10 parking spaces, you're at 0.042. I don't have to say that here because the previous requirement would push it up there. And then the buildings would go from 0.033 to 0.0625 to 0.086. And then everything else would be at 0.1. That gets a little steep, so that's kind of the high end. Now we're requiring a more robust amount of landscaping. If you went up to 0.1, we could stop it at 0.086 if we wanted to. So I was just trying to get some ideas out there for how the simplest and straightest is just go for the 0.033, and that's the quick and clean way of doing it. It works for the small ones and it works for the big ones.
Are we aware of any other cities that have different factors or different approaches for structures versus impervious surface?
Not really. I haven't seen. Some of the issues that have come up with landscaping is that a lot of times it is a strictly subjective standard. They will do more of a performance standard approach. Most communities would go with, take your purpose statement, pull those out, stick them in as performance standards, and go and say, you have to demonstrate this. The problem with that is we're trying to have a lot of our stuff be administrative, so we really want to start to be a little more objective, a little less subjective in our rules, so that way our administrators can go through and process, because most of our applications, we get a couple hundred applications a year, 15 of them go to the DRB. So if we send site plan and say all site plans have to go to the DRB, then we're sending a lot to the DRB to evaluate the reasonable person standards and the subjectiveness. So we tried, as we said, some of the way Brandy's been proposing to do it. We think this new way kind of tweaks what she's doing, puts it on a better foundation, because we're linking it to the size of the buildings, at least the footprint and the size of the parking areas. Because by linking it to impervious cover, we've got more impervious cover, the more landscaping you need. Seems like a pretty reasonable.
And previously, we talked about the distillery. We all got that example. So I think a lot of us, it helps to talk about these examples for us to, because we can imagine how many trees and acreage, but it's hard to take the math and get there.
Yeah.
So tell us what we're looking at now, how that would look compared with what we discussed last time with the distillery project, where we went into some depth on.
Were they meeting the other requirements too? Were they meeting, now the updated
They didn't
ones?
have to meet any requirements previously, so we were kind of taking it because they were under the old zoning.
So is it, but would they have met, I guess is my question. So would they have already have had to add more for parking or for
Yes.
screening? Yeah, because that's part of it too, I think. If we look at that side and say this wasn't enough, well, this is in addition to those if it's lower, right?
No, these aren't in addition. These are the
Well, if they
total
haven't met this
landscaping.
already.
Yep. You may meet your total landscaping requirement before you get here. This was
Right.
kind of intended as, in our current zoning, total landscaping is actually kind of at the top or in the middle. And we kind of wanted to make sure it was clear. We put it at the bottom. We relocated all those standards to go through and say, we've got screening, street trees, parking, and screening are the 3 requirements, but each one of them has exemptions. So you might get all the way through there and you don't get to go and say, yes, no landscaping. No, you do have a minimum. You have to at least meet this much. You may meet it through your street trees. You may meet it through.
Right, that's what I meant, in addition
Yeah.
was the right, right.
So-
But if you've met the other things and you're
Yeah.
already over this amount, you don't have to do it.
So
Then
did
you
this-
won't have to do
Did this
anything
end up
at-
applying to the distillery project, or was it met already from this parking and other?
And it sounds like if they
It
had
was
been under
not.
this rule, they would have had to do more before this.
They were
Yes.
adopted under old zoning, but
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
But if they
yeah,
were
but
under
if they
this
were, they
rule-
would have failed our new zoning.
Mhm.
We have
regardless of
we have
this.
older zoning, old zoning, and
Yeah,
we-
we have old zoning,
Oldest.
current zoning, and proposed zoning.
Yeah.
But,
Yes,
right, but
under-
if they'd been under this rule, not including this, they already would have had to do more, because they wouldn't have met the parking requirements.
Yeah,
at
they would have.
least.
Yeah, they would not have had enough parking shading.
that's
And I think
important
looking at
too.
the site plan, we would have agreed, at least as planning commissioners, that it would have been reasonable for them to have provided more shading for that parking lot of that size.
But this would give them a numerical number to use to say, okay, this is the area that needs to be provided as a minimum, and here's where it should be. Some of it should be shading the parking, some of it should be in other locations.
Yeah, they will meet they'll go through and meet those first 3 requirements, and then we will get to the total landscaping where we add everything up and see if they've met. And if they're deficient, we'll have to add some more parking or add some more landscaping
Similar.
in one of these 6 or 7 places that are identified.
So when you say these factors, you sort of work them out in your head and they make sense, what does that mean exactly? Like you feel like you look at examples and they have, I'm just trying to grasp what that they don't have too much of a burden of landscaping, but
In certain cases, I look at a project. So some of the new ones, I looked at Hunger Mountain Co-op, Caledonia Spirits we had looked at before, 184 Elm Street we looked at before. Tractor Supply was a new one that I looked at.
What were the, I guess,
Burger,
what were the
but
criteria you were
Buddy's
looking
Burgers.
for, is the question.
yeah, thank you.
For all of these ideas, as we try to kind of flesh out these ideas, which numbers seem to make sense. So what I would do is, let's say, if I happen to be working on an idea of like, maybe we do a .06 for the building and a .03 for the parking lot. I would run them through Hunger Mountain Co-op and go and say, well, what did the total come out to, and what did they plant, and do I think, in my personal opinion, do I think there was enough landscaping there? In some cases, if it comes out, it's like they would be a little bit short, or it's unclear whether those were medium trees or large trees. If those were large trees, then they would count and they would meet it. If they're medium trees, then they're not. But so that's kind of how I looked at them. Like Hunger Mountain Co-op has 30,000 square feet of impervious. They have 22 medium trees and 9 small trees. Now we can start adjusting the things. Is that enough landscaping in that parking lot? It doesn't count any of their riparian buffer that they have along the river. Just,
So would that meet the total landscaping as we have in this proposed version?
in certain cases, I'd have to, if it's, I don't hear this calculator.
So I think, Ariane's getting at it, which is, there's 2 things to consider here. There's administrative ease of implementing these regs, which is very important, and we leave it to you to determine the best way to do that. But then there's the substantive question of how much landscaping is the appropriate amount. And so in testing your administrative formula, we kind of want to know, like, how did you settle on this particular factor? What were you looking at? And
Yeah.
You're using your professional judgment in determining what was the adequate amount of coverage and landscaping, and that's perfectly acceptable, but we just wanna make sure we're having a discussion about it.
Yeah, and it's hard somewhat. I mean, like in this case here, we're talking about Hunger Mountain Co-op, 30,000 square feet of impervious cover. If we just did .033 for everything, that means they would have to do 990 square feet of landscaping, which, for everyone who's not up to speed with what we're doing, a large tree would be worth 100, a medium tree would be worth 49, a small tree is worth 25, shrubs are worth 6 or 8 or 10. Perennial landscaping is 1 to 1.
So they would have more than enough, because you said 9 large trees and
They would have enough.
15
They have
medium?
22 medium trees and 9 small trees, which is 1,303. So they would have met the minimum requirement.
And
Now they may have been way over. If we looked at it from the standpoint of parking, we may have said, well, for parking, you actually needed to have more and bigger trees. They may have been required to have 1,500 square feet of medium trees, or something, depending on how big. I don't
So
know.
what I'm hearing, because again, I'm trying to conceptualize, and sorry, Barb, if I cut you
No,
off there.
that's fine.
But a .033 sounds like a small enough number for the total tree that it sounds like it's going to usually be caught by parking before it gets to that. It sounds like what I'm understanding is the .033 is so lenient that it's probably not going to catch anything that's not already caught by the other standards. Does that seem right?
For certain projects, if we're talking about Hunger Mountain Co-op and Tractor Supply, we're talking about places that have big parking lots. So absolutely, if they meet their parking lot requirement, they're probably meeting most of their total landscaping requirement. And in fact, I would almost guarantee they are, because the parking lot landscape is required at .042. So if you have a lot of parking and our requirement for total is .033, then you're going to probably meet it all. But Buddy's Burgers has no parking. It's just the building. They don't even own their parking lot. That parking lot's owned by the abutters. So when they want to put a deck on their building, and I calculated theirs comes out to needing 75 square feet of landscaping. And they have some small squares in the front. They actually have one crabapple tree. So we're like, all right, look, you put a crabapple tree here, you put a crabapple tree there, and you have some yews, which they do have. You could meet 75 square feet pretty easily in that. And that's about as urban as you're going to get. Probably 90+% coverage on that parcel, and they still could meet it. So it works for really small ones, the .033, but as I said before, when you get up to some of these middle-sized ones, it'll probably be met through other things like parking, and it'll be a little bit on the low side. But then when we get to these really big sites, that was where we were coming to this point where we kind of have this, it's not a linear thing. As the sites get really big, it becomes really easy to meet a requirement, and you also have a lot of these extra existing trees, and you're like, oh, I need 7 trees and I've got 3 acres. Which 7 trees would you like me to pick? And that was where some of these ones just come up for the other extreme of the really big lots. And then I think these middle ones are where we may get Hunger Mountain Co-op. So that was my thought, and as I said, some of these, the numbers I pulled together, we had done the parking lot calculations, and .042 is how that factors, So I think we kind of have a feel. It just depends a little bit of, if we want to have a minimum, here's some ideas to go with: .033, .042. We had come about it in different ways and kind of came back and found these other numbers. I think we just need a number, or as I proposed kind of in the written example, to split it between your buildings are going to be factored at one rate and your other impervious at another rate. It's a little bit more complicated, but we can do it.
Sorry, Mike, where was the .042?
It's not technically written in here, but and I can always go back and convert it. If you were to look at the parking lot requirements, so the minimum planting for point H, which would be page 360. Minimum planting requirement for number 3, minimum shall be 40% of the area. So 40% of the parking area. I added the words including aisles and driveways because it was unclear. But B, each large tree shall be considered to be 1,200 square feet. Each medium tree shall be considered to be 600 square feet. So if you kind of take those 1,200 and 600 and go to the 40% parking area and do all the math on it, it comes out 0.042. Because I was kind of curious about where the numbers would play out, so I knew, like I said, when I did for the existing zoning, if I building perimeters and the requirements, that came out 0.19, so that's much higher. So I think we're in a range that could work. It's just going to be has to be 0.033 for the 90% district.
Because of the very small.
Just because there's very little land that's left for landscaping. So I think that has to be there. So if we're going to do something, it starts at that. Maybe there's just everybody is this except for that one district, or 90% is this, 80% is this, everybody else is something else. I think if you want my recommendation, I'm somewhat tempted to go with the 0.033 and kind of just see how that goes.
As it's written
It's a lot
here.
cleaner.
It's a
Don't
lot
like just the
cleaner,
0.033.
it's a minimum standard. I think a lot of people are gonna meet it I think it's gonna catch the ones we wanna catch, the people who don't have any or are really insufficient. It adds a little bit more to a couple of projects that we have all recognized. I think if I looked at 0.033 and it said Caledonia Spirits is good, then I think I would be a little bit more likely to say, I don't know. I think we've all kind of agreed that needed a little bit more landscaping.
And on the flip side, though, taking the structures into account with the numbers you gave, errs on the side of more trees.
Yeah, it would add more trees, yep. If we factored structures at a higher rate, then we would end up with more trees or more landscaping.
Yeah, separating the two seems unnecessarily complicated to me, though. Structures from other impervious.
It's more difficult to do the building than it is for other impervious cover. They do have sort of different characteristics, different aspects to them.
Right.
So, I'd never thought about doing it separately, but
From the public's point of view, they tell you their square footage for their structures and their square footage for their impervious, right?
They just give us
And then you tell them the
impervious.
square footage they need for landscaping,
Yeah,
right?
that's the
So
way it
from
would
the
work.
user's
But
perspective,
right now, we're
Yes.
not
Choose.
asking them to differentiate. We just asked them
Yeah.
for an impervious cover. How much of your property is impervious cover?
Ah.
They don't split between the two.
Which either way is still simpler, I think, if there's a way to do it.
Yeah. And just for
But-
example, the Caledonia Spirits, we had calculated that the site plan had 1,600 square feet of landscaping. With a 0.033 on everything, it comes out to 2,635. So they would actually have to add,
Okay.
with that factor, 1,000 more, 1,000 more square feet, which, again, as we said, with that site as empty as it is,
That's
Thousands.
what I needed to hear
Yeah.
to be able to conceptualize what the 0.033 means.
Yeah, so, I'm sorry, so that was just the 0.33 apply? Isn't
yeah,
that
it's just the,
okay,
there's no higher factor for the
for the building.
building, yeah.
Okay.
But ultimately, they need to be able to provide with the square footage of the building as well. I mean, maybe not the
Yeah, for
zoning
other reasons,
application,
but not
for
for-
other
yeah.
permit applications, so it's not as if you're asking them for information that they
Yeah,
don't
the
already
question that comes up
provide.
at that point is, once you start having structures, buildings, is where things fall into the gray area of whether it's a structure or a building of a,
So is your
Yeah.
recommendation
Oh, I
that
count
for
my
all
yard.
districts and all impervious cover, the factor be .033?
yes.
As written here.
It's
Yes.
not as written here. I would have to amend this. I kind of put the more complex version in here so you could actually visualize it and see it. It's easier to go through and say, we're just gonna strike it all back to number 1 and, or A, and the factor's .033.
So we get rid of B through D, and then in districts with maximum cover, A would be changed to just
Just the factors.
the factor is, yeah.
Yeah.
For all impervious
That's
cover?
true, yeah. We didn't-
But, so then that removes all the structure
Yep.
pieces. Ah. So in,
I think you just add this to 2, to determine the square footage of planning
Yeah.
area that will be required, multiply .033 with
Yeah.
the square footage
Yep.
of the total proposed impervious cover. I'm comfortable with that, I mean, is everyone,
I'm comfortable with that.
and we
That's-
have
So-
this.
Start
draft
with
which is
simple. If
fine.
it doesn't work, we go to more complex later.
So where it
The
might
other way
not work,
around.
it sounds like is in a more rural, larger project where the .033 might stand out because it might be too little landscaping because it's something that's big that's out somewhere. But in the urban area, it seems like, yeah, because there's already stuff crammed in, that the .033 is going to work fine.
Yeah, I think where it will work the least is with somebody who may have a parking lot of 9 parking spaces, so they miss out on the .042. So they end up in the total landscaping, and I think there's some scenarios which could play out. But again, when we're looking at this, we're trying to look at it as a minimum, and I think a lot of cases come up, people aren't meeting even the .033 minimum. So I think this is already going to push people up to a higher standard. And I think if we find there are examples where it's still not being pushed far enough, you know, again, we've already looked at 3 projects that were approved under the previous zoning, that each one of which we said, oh, we would have probably wanted to see more different landscaping in those, whether it was Caledonia Spirits, even Hunger Mountain Co-op could probably, depending on whether they were large trees or medium trees, I think we would have been better about making sure their trees were more appropriate for shading those parking lots,
So-
considering it being replaced.
how does this apply to, say, future developments that have no parking?
Buddies? Oh, no.
What's that?
Yeah, like buddies.
Like buddies.
Yeah, or you know, as we decrease the amount of impervious cover that we contribute to parking, so that there in that .033 is just applying to the building footprint itself. So in that case, it's lower than what you were proposing here because the .03 is lower than the.
But I think in those cases,
Structure.
what you would find is this is the amount that's landscaped. So if you don't have a parking area and you have, your alternative is you need to have a certain amount landscaped, the rest of it's going to be grass. Because
Well, we hope so.
Because
it's
it's not impervious.
not impervious and it's not landscaped. It's got to be something that's kind of falls into. So I think this is really looking at having a arithmetic way of being able to say how many trees and shrubs. So we don't end up with just lawn. We end up with some shade.
I mean, the overall goal is to mitigate the surfaces, the urban heat island, right? So
Yeah.
that, you know, it depends on, I'm just trying to imagine how that would be affected as we reduce the amount of land developed as parking. So, I mean, it could basically come out as a wash. Just want to make sure we don't encourage more parking. That's all.
Yes,
Yeah.
and what we didn't want to do is to have the factor get, and I mean, if it's decided, it doesn't really matter. We didn't want to have the factor for parking get above the .04 because you're already meeting Because then we're having to make up more landscaping somewhere else for the impervious cover that's already been taken care of. And so people with a lot of parking lot may end up with lots of additional landscaping somewhere else to make up for the fact that their parking lot landscaping didn't provide enough. So that would be the maximum for the parking lot landscaping is at .042, but as long as it's .033, people may have more. We hope people will have more. People may have more simply because they meet one of those other requirements under screening. I mean, remember, if you've got a non-residential next to a residential, you have to provide screening to protect the residential uses that are next door. And you don't get to come into the DRB and saying, yeah, but you guys can only make me plant 7 trees because that's all. No, it works the other way around. You do your screening first, then we see if you meet your landscaping
Minimum.
requirement. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it might encourage you to meet your screening with landscaping instead of fencing,
Yes. Yep.
if you have to meet screening anyway.
Yeah, if you already have to meet screening, and it gives encouragement for people to support planting street trees, because your street trees count. So,
Alright,
I
so
think we're good?
is everyone comfortable with that approach? We can revisit it if needed.
Yeah, can I just, one quick question? Mike, I just want to say thanks. This is like a very elegant solution to a sticky problem that we've been grappling with the last couple of meetings. And I don't doubt the rigor with which you've come up with these numbers, but I'm just curious, how many models did you crunch, or how many hypotheticals did you crunch to come up with the number?
I would say at least, between 10 and 15 different examples of pulling out site
Yep.
plans and counting the trees and what's out there and looking at examples. And this has been reviewed by Audra, who is the assistant zoning administrator, and Meredith, who's the zoning administrator, and we've kind of chewed over the different.
Yep.
And they would throw out very specific examples. What about the problem on Berlin Street? We had a big problem on Berlin Street with this particular one, and we would pull it out and say, well, under the old rules, they needed 14 trees and 87 shrubs. Under the new rules, it's this. And they're like, oh, well, that's actually reasonable.
Okay.
That's good.
Yep,
Thanks
thanks.
for doing that. Anything else in the landscape? Is that it?
No, I think that's it. I'll make these changes. I think the only thing that'd be pending would be what the tree board comes up with for that, which I may just have to make a decision on that. If it gets to the city council and the tree board hasn't made a decision, then I guess I would recommend that get pulled, but otherwise I think we would keep it in there for now. Or do you guys want me to pull it and add it later because we have 2 processes, so everyone remembers. We've got this fast track on this one, and then we've got the
Right.
second one. I could always go and add that on the second one if we want. The second punch list, so that would just get struck.
So I like the placeholder that you put in. I think it's fine.
Okay.
This is on, what is, anyone?
358.
Yeah, I mean, I guess unless hypothetically they don't adopt something consistent with the ANSI standards. I can't imagine that, but I don't.
Well,
I'm a little
if they
hesitant.
do, we can always recommend a change.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yep.
that makes sense.
I think it's fine. I think it's something people can follow, and I don't think it's gonna actually cause any administrative snags anyway.
Do I have a motion to forward the revisions to the landscaping and screening section of the zoning with the modifications that we agreed upon tonight to city council?
So moved?
Do I have a second?
A second?
Any discussion? Any further discussion? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay, and the motion carries.
Okay, we have a draft.
Great. All right, so Mike, I think you might be the one. Barb moved. Ariane,
Yes, Barb moved, Ariane
Okay.
seconded.
we're
You
good.
got it.
That's item 5. Moving on to item 6. We have about a half an hour. Well, 25 minutes. We have to get to our minutes last time. So, Aaron, I think you're coming into this cold. The slope issue. So, as part of the punch list of issues with the zoning that was recently passed, Mike brought up this issue of this prohibition on building on slopes, over 30%. And there are no exceptions to the rule as written right now.
Waivers.
Waivers. And therefore, there were certain instances where it was coming up and it didn't necessarily make sense to deny the application, like when, for example, a retaining wall is being built, that would naturally be a slope higher than 30%. So, we had some discussion about that, and I think there's two parts to this. One is the prohibition on slopes, and the second part is the calculation of density. Previously, the intent was to have that calculation be built on the buildable area on a lot. The proposal that we've received from staff would be to cut that calculation, because the calculation was proving to be administratively very difficult with the data that we have now. That's my understanding of the issue. Mike, is there anything else I missed?
No, that pretty much.
Yep.
These changes are actually unlike what you just went through. And if anyone doesn't have them, this still has the landscaping on the back half, but if somebody wants to see the slope ones, I've just got a couple of these left.
What's the date on that?
All right. Well,
Take
this was of the 11/7. So the changes here are actually pretty straightforward.
Oh, maybe I have that here.
Which page?
So this is kind of a strikeout. So on this page, this just deletes under 302.c. There used to be a section in there that would go and say, in all other districts, the maximum residential density shall be based upon the lot's buildable area rather than total acreage or square footage, which does not include any land with slopes greater than 30% as mapped on the attached map, or wetlands or these other things. So that, in this case, the policy is very, I wouldn't say complicated. That's what we're really talking about, rather than wordsmithing, because it really is striking that thing that says we're going to use buildable area. And then 2 pages later on 317, the actual changes here go through, and it used to say all development of land in this category is prohibited, and same with the engineered plans, all development on this slope is prohibited. What we've said is all development shall require a hearing, all development on this land shall require engineered plans. So those are the pretty, I guess the what's changing is pretty straightforward. The question is, should we make that change or not?
Yeah, so staff recommendation was to, as far as the buildable area, just to delete that portion, right?
Yes.
And then, as far as the prohibition on building on steep slopes, the recommendation was to, make it so that you could build on slopes over 30% if you have, an engineer has provided plans and DRB approval, right?
Yes.
That's I've read all these things, but I want to make sure I'm getting it
Yeah.
accurate.
Yeah. So we're not going through and exempting and not regulating it. We're simply going through and saying we're taking away the prohibition to go through and say, okay, if you've got an engineer, then, and we have a hearing.
So Barb raised some concerns based on, well, there's the two different issues. One is, I mean, and they're tied together because slopes are part of what we've classified as unbuildable area. Like over
So if they're
30%.
unbuildable, then, yeah.
So, but one is that we put forward these proposed density maximums in various districts to the public and propose this, and we were conveying this message that we calculated this with the idea in mind that you would have a maximum for your particular lot based on buildable area. The actual number that you crunched would be based on that, so we wouldn't have a really, a lot with a lot of unbuildable area, and then all of the density that you would get if, assuming it was all buildable, kind of cramped in one area. That was the concern, and that's what we expressed to the public. And then the other part of it was with slopes. Well, maybe you can articulate your concern with the slopes. I mean, it was that concern, and then it gets pulled in with slopes buildable, though no longer unbuildable.
Right, I mean, those two issues can be separated, I
Yeah.
think. The question is it good practice to build on a slope of 30% or more? Under the regional planning, it's one of the members of the public brought up to me that the Regional Planning Commission recommends not building on slopes over 25%. So there is there is a rationale that it's not good practice to build on steep slopes.
Right.
So, but rather than prohibiting it, then Mike's proposal that just says we need engineered plans. The wording as written does not, you could apply for a waiver, so it doesn't absolutely blanket prohibit any development on slopes of 30% or more, but it just makes it much more difficult to do. So that piece becomes one issue that I think, to my mind, we can separate. And I see if we keep a tight control on it, then perhaps, this idea of having engineered plans makes sense. It's the other piece that has me more concerned, that if we eliminate what was a kind of, to my mind, a sort of bedrock aspect of how we establish the densities in the first place, and say, okay, a site that has a 30% or 30% slope, and it's a half an acre, is exactly the same as a site that is a flat site and half an acre, and they should be able to have the same number of units built on them. That's where I think we get, to my mind, into concern. And it brings back some of the example projects that had happened, within the last year or so, that were under concern with the public, and particularly the issue of the Sibley Street project. And so I took a look at, if we were to say that site was just, we were going to calculate the density based on the total footprint of that site, how many units could we put on it? And how different would that actually be than what was proposed and very strongly reacted to against by the public?
Yeah, so before we get too further
into
into the
the weeds.
substance of it, I just wanted to say, so the planning commission voted to adopt Mike's proposal, staff's proposal. But we also agreed that we should outline Barb's concerns and the risks associated with taking that approach to the city council as we put forward this recommendation. So I asked Mike and Barb if they could draft a memo to city council. We've got two different memos that we can either merge or file separately. I would encourage us to merge our memos so that we're speaking with one voice. But that's what this discussion tonight is going to be talking about.
Right.
I mean, how do we want to do that?
And is it possible to come to some kind of a compromise that then we could actually bring forward with, to, at least from my standpoint, with a common voice?
Yeah, well, we can talk about your examples because that might help to illustrate. So Barb wrote a memo and Mike wrote a memo reacting to that, responding to it. So let's talk about, let's share.
Maybe.
There's another one.
Yeah.
Do you want one, Kirby?
Sure, thanks.
As
I've read them, but I feel like it's
starting place? Do you mind, I mean, is
Yeah,
there
go ahead.
anything that you would wanna change in your memo based on what Mike's response?
Well, I think, I mean, for me, it kind of helps to kind of take a step back and say, you know, yeah, we can get into the weeds here. There's a lot of weeds on his reaction as well as my original. But I think the point for me is really to look at what do we want to be able to accomplish with whatever we determine is the best approach. And I totally agree that as we knew that when we went forward with this zoning, that things were going to come up that were going to prove to be very difficult to apply. And at least from my standpoint, I think one of the issues had to do with the scale of the development that was being considered. And that this 30% or the buildable area issue really comes up to my mind in terms of the of new multifamily development, not somebody trying to expand an existing house, putting an addition or something like that on. So it really, you know, how could we modify this to apply to that in lieu of?
One of the things that Mike wrote in your memo is that the eliminating that buildable area aspect of the density calculations wouldn't allow for any more density than what's on the ground currently. Did I interpret that correctly?
From the zoning standpoint, so when we calculated those district densities that are in our zoning, we didn't remove the buildable area when we figured out what the density should be. We looked at what's actually on the ground. So removing the buildable area will change the amount of building potential from the current zoning because you're no longer going to be reducing that amount. But whether that makes a difference compared to what your neighbors, you know, looking at what's on the ground, from the zoning standpoint, probably not, because the zoning was set up assuming we had flat buildable area in these neighborhoods. So when we found the 90% rules, we founded them.
So Barb, what does the buildable area calculation provide that the other size, scale, massing requirements don't?
Well, because I've been thinking about this, that it, to me, one of those elements of character of the neighborhood is the fact that historically we've only built on relatively flat areas of a site. So we are not already building on steep slopes historically. And if we want to maintain historical development patterns, which I, you know, heard pretty strongly from the public that was a desirable thing to do, that's one of those aspects that we need to be considering as well. That unfortunately, you know, we want to say that our other pieces, our other requirements define character of the neighborhood, but they really don't. And that was actually the point of my doing the 3 examples that I did, because we could meet every one of those other criteria that we say are defining character of the neighborhood, but is this really, do those developments reflect the character of the neighborhood? Is that?
I'm not following, and
Okay.
I think it's my fault.
No,
not
it's all right. I'm
yours.
sorry. Let me go back a bit. We had said, or Mike said in his response, that that we have other ways to make
Right.
sure that development is consistent with neighborhoods, with the character of neighborhoods. One of them is footprint, one of them is setback, one of them is potentially number of units, scale, massing, articulation, all of those aspects. And I guess my feeling is that those are not enough. And that was why I felt strongly that when we instituted the piece about buildable area, what that did was it reflected the density of the buildings that were occurring in an existing neighborhood. So it reflected the character of the neighborhood as well. As well as all of those other characteristics. So if we remove that one and say, we remove that criteria, and we are left with just scale, massing, articulation, footprint, all of that, is that enough to maintain the character of the neighborhoods that we feel strongly about? And so that's why I did the examples, because I feel that it
Is the
doesn't.
thought that removing the calculation based on buildable area would result, and the prohibition on slopes, it's going to result in a change in character of the neighborhood because the buildings will be built on different slopes? Is that?
Not so much the slopes, but if we, again, separate those two issues. So let's set aside building on a 30% slope.
Okay.
Is it that different from building on a 25% slope? Probably not, So if we set that piece aside, but it has more to do with the density calculation.
Mhm.
And the fact that we represented to the public, there was a lot of concern among the public that our densities were too high. And we said, but this is, we're going to make sure that any development that happens is consistent with neighborhoods because we've got this slope exclusion.
But I think what I heard from Mike was that the density calculations were calculated without that in mind.
Oh, when the 90% rule was, yeah.
Right.
But that was what people were coming up against and saying
So
that
people
they
were
were.
upset about the densities that we proposed, even though they reflect what's on the ground.
Technically
They thought they're too high. even
technically
though
they
it's
reflect what's on the ground
Which
because
I
it's
remember very well.
it's an
because I read
average. Yeah, right, it's an average. So we were saying that we have this extra step that it came into the process to ensure that overdevelopment does not happen.
So my understanding of that piece of the process, and Kirby, were you with us at this point?
I was there near the end
Okay.
when this happened,
Well,
what you're talking
let me give my
about.
perspective and then
Sure.
you can add yours or correct me. But, cause I'm still not sleeping well and my recollection is not as strong, my strong suit right now. But my recollection is that we assured the public that the buildable area being taken into account would prevent a really out of scale building from popping up in a neighborhood, because everyone could just group your density into one little corner of your parcel, and then you would have this giant building. And then we developed the other requirements, the scale, size, massing, footprint, and my thought was that got at the issue. So that was my understanding.
My understanding was the same thing, that we have all of these other requirements that are getting at the character of the neighborhood issue, which is what people are, at the heart of it, the public was concerned about the character of the neighborhood changing, and density that's allowing densities that are too high would change their character of their neighborhood. So density became a proxy for character of the neighborhood.
Mhm.
And John Adams has convinced me at this point, because he's talked about this a lot, and others that I've heard talk about this that are with a planning background have convinced me at this point to say that density is really, it's a red herring as far as for character of the neighborhood. It's easy for people because it's a number. It's easy for people to look at density and say, that's going to determine what my neighborhood's like. But really, it's all the other rules that we have in place that determine what your neighborhood's like. And density is just this looking in the wrong direction. And that's kind of like where, when this conversation played out, that's kind of where I ended up personally on it, was realizing, because at the beginning, I too thought that density had a lot of importance. And now I realize it's actually a pretty poor proxy for character of the neighborhood.
Why?
It dictates the number of people that can.
It's
Number
like, it's like
of
your
housing units.
yeah, the number of units that are allowed on a parcel,
Yeah.
So it could be
it's
this
a poor
beautiful
proxy.
old Victorian.
that gets
That
split up
looks
into
like-
5 units, but looks exactly the same.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that's, you know,
Yeah,
it's
one
no different
7-bedroom
character-wise.
Victorian could get split into.
And there might be more
studios.
humans
7
around,
studios.
but
Okay.
But actually, yeah, but you would,
and
oh, sorry.
it might have parking. It might have some other, but we have our setbacks rules. We have a lot of zoning rules that just kind of put another like a real check on. It's very difficult to reach maximum density on any parcel, and the reason why we increase the amounts is basically because Mike determined that we're out of conformance anyway. We're like way over the old density requirements in all our neighborhoods, so we were just changed it to reflect reality.
Right.
So
And
that's what I
The 90%
remember.
rule was, this test was done, so if 90% of the parcels in this district would be in conformance with this density, then that seems like that's a good
Right.
gauge for where we are now, and what we wanna maintain.
But I guess I would argue with, with Kirby's assertion that the number of housing units has no influence on the character of the neighborhood, because it definitely does. I mean, even, I'll tell you that my neighbors know that I have a 2-family house, not just a 1-family house. It's really, and if I then suddenly took my house and changed it into 5 units, that would have a significant impact on my neighborhood, which is mostly 1 and 2-family houses. So
And
that's,
I think my reply to that in the memo was that really, really, really sounds like a proposal to amend the use table. I mean, we keep getting off on this buildable area. This is her parcel, and I have to calculate her density on that slope map, and it's just,
Oh, it's a slope map. Okay.
that's a slope map. All the red is slopes.
Like,
The darkest red is the slopes that are over 30%.
30%,
Right.
right.
So it really becomes, how do you calculate such a number so we can enforce and administer those rules without having a large test? But really, if the concern is having a multifamily will change the character of my neighborhood, right now multifamily is either a permitted or a conditional use, then the proposal should be, the problem isn't the fact that somebody's going to have a 5,000 square foot house, it's that they're going to have a 5,000 square foot house that's been broken into 5 or more units. Because if your concern is 5 or more units is the problem, then change the use table to go and say you can't have multifamily housing in this neighborhood. Not let's try to adjust the buildable area to the point that somebody can't, if it turns out that most of Barb's parcel is 25% slopes, it's all going to be buildable, and she can build it there, and officially you'd be saying, yeah, that's fine. As long as it's 25% slope, it's okay that I have 8 units. But if that's 30%, then it's not okay for me to have 8 units.
well, I know it's an arbitrary number, but it was a number that we determined was at least a reasonable level. And at least some portions of that site will be over 30%. So that would automatically reduce the 3/4 acre that exists now in terms of buildable area. So the sketches that I did, which I don't know if anybody actually saw,
Yep.
had to do with whether, what the actual effects of that would be. And I'll show this to Aaron because I don't know if you saw this.
Got it.
Okay,
Yeah, I think that's part of
okay.
this. It's appended to the memo, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, the issue being that, given if that entire 3/4 acre parcel was considered, and if we allowed a density bonus because it would be really easy to make it an infill PUD, then it would be possible to end up having a significant number of units, 8 units on a site that is currently 2. Surrounded by, as you'll see, the numbers on the building surrounding it are the number of housing units in the neighborhood. And any of that development that's indicated there would meet any of the setback footprint, any of the other parking as well, requirements. And what I'm saying is that, to my mind, that is too dense. It doesn't reflect, without that, if it would, basically if the slope exclusion was ignored, then about 3 units, you know, it would bring it down to 4 units.
Barb, does this comply with all the setbacks
Mhm.
and, okay.
Yep, footprint, yeah, the whole 9 yards. And it's a 2,500 square foot footprint, so 2 units per floor. You could end up with 4 units. And as you see, looking at the massing of the building, it's not that different from the 2 adjacent properties just down the street. So it's not as if it's totally out of scale. So I think, you know, so that's sort of where I started was, okay, does it really make a difference, what we're trying to accomplish here? And I think it does. I mean, I think it has a serious impact because historically, the whole 3/4 of an acre would never have been built on because it was a steep slope. Technically now we could, of course, we could build on the back portion of that. But historically it would not have been. That's why all the houses are along the street in the relatively flat areas. Most of these sites in the back half of them do, in fact, have significant slopes on them. And as I pointed out before, I mean, I recognize that administratively, Mike would like to be able to tell people, you know, what their slope percentage is. But if somebody's going to be doing a development like this, they would need to be getting an engineered plan in the first place. And so any engineer, even any site designer would be able to come up and with the percentage
And
that's
I think
over 30%.
it works in that situation, but I think the issue administratively is that for any sort of addition or porch or, I mean, you'd have to get an engineer to help Mike know your buildable area.
Well, I think that's my point, is that it's, to me, it's more significant in terms of if we're increasing the number of units on the property, not just if we're adding on to an existing.
Right, so
Using it as a
anytime you
density
add-
designation.
What if you're increasing number of units, but you're not changing the building at all? Or, I mean, or maybe you're adding in a small kitchen or something.
Yeah, well, but you're not
Yeah.
changing the external
Yeah.
appearance of the, well, I still think that there, you know, is, I mean, there's certainly a cost associated with that. There's a benefit to the property owner to add an additional unit to an existing building. So to ask them to do a site plan is not unreasonable. And in some cases might already have to provide a site plan. So that's why I'm not sure that I understand that the requirement for having an engineer involved, who could then designate what was 30% or
So I
greater.
think I'm better understanding this question about whether the use table is the better, I mean, it sounds like there's a question of how to deal with this issue of character in the neighborhood and whether it's gonna be through density calculations, what uses are allowed.
But it's also a direct decision to be made, which I think is what I pointed out in the memo, which was that in her example, the only way she could do her example with that much was to do a PUD, which would mean it would have to be, as we pointed out, the only way you should be able to exceed our densities is if it was a well-designed project. We spent a year or more working on our PUD standards to death. But to be what she proposed, it would have to be a well-designed senior housing living facility that will provide perpetually affordable housing units in HERS-rated facilities with a score less than 50. Then you would be able to apply to get up to 8 units. So it's not like everybody walking in gets to go and get this. You'd have to have a well-designed project, 2 public hearings, character of the neighborhood, and traffic are actual requirements. So if it doesn't meet character of the neighborhood, the neighbors are going to have an opportunity to discuss this point.
But those are not criteria that are that difficult to meet, frankly. I mean, you know, most new buildings are gonna meet the HERS rating. And, you know, it's not,
Perpetually affordable is more challenging than you
that's
might
right.
Yeah,
That's not
that's-
one that I would necessarily choose, you know?
Oh,
There are 8 different criteria to choose from.
So you
And
would only have to do one of those, the hers, well, not that this is
I think it's
Two or
three.
three of them, I don't
Three,
remember which
yeah.
one it is for that one.
So, yeah, so the particular criteria, I mean, we were trying to allow a lot of flexibility.
Okay.
So it's, yeah.
realize that, but-
So perpetually affordable was not gonna be one of them, but ADA, accessible, yes, that kind of thing.
So you have to do 2 of those to get a 25% bonus, density bonus, or 3 to get a 50% bonus, and that's in regs, you don't know.
And
Oh,
out
okay.
of the
I
8.
missed that.
So, I mean, the affordable.
2 of the following, I see.
So, yeah, I mean, I just want, because we're
But,
kind of throwing out
yeah,
a
if
lot of
it's,
information.
yeah, but if
Yeah.
it gets to a point where it's, if it's to the point where, under no circumstances, so in other words, even if a HERS-rated senior facility with perpetually affordable housing is unacceptable, this still is not a buildable area question. This is, it absolutely shouldn't be allowed anywhere if we're not gonna allow it for a HERS rating senior facility perpetually affordable. Then it should just change the use table to say we're not gonna allow it in that neighborhood. And otherwise, we're just
Not gonna allow what in that neighborhood?
multifamily housing. If you're gonna say you don't want a senior housing facility that's perpetually affordable and HERS rated the best that we can do, and you still are gonna oppose that, it's just not a use that you think should be allowed in the district. And the rest of it is just a red herring that it's the buildable area that's the issue. It's not the buildable area that's the issue. It's the fact that it's multifamily.
No, I don't think, that's not the way I see it, is that, no, I don't have any problem with multifamily if there was enough site area that was flat, that was reasonably, that it could accommodate that level of development, that number of units. So to me, it's not about the use, it's about the appropriateness of the development within the neighborhood.
What if it's across the street, where it's a little flatter, if I recall Liberty well enough? Not
It's
quite as steep as your
It's
backyard,
not.
right?
No, it's steep over here too.
There's
So,
not a little bit more flat, let's hypothetically.
Let's say it's on Loomis.
Hypothetically,
Yeah,
let's say,
Yeah.
it
let's
gives
say,
some of the,
let's say it is across the street and that it's the slope issues taken out of it, so you'd be fine with the 8 units going in and that same.
well, there are properties down the street where
Right.
there are flatter,
Yeah, I'm aware. I
that's-
used to live in one of them.
Yeah, the one across the street that has, I think, 5 units in it. And that's
There's-
it's.
On the corner of Liberty and Loomis, there's a 6 unit that I used to live in, and then across from that, which is also on the corner of Liberty and Loomis, a different corner, there's, I don't know how many units are in there,
No,
it's huge.
there's only, I think there are only 5 or 6 in
It's
that
only
one
5 or
too.
6 in that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I know
Yeah,
that,
so
I
those-
know that is part of the neighborhood is large multifamily,
Yeah, except
units.
that that's not in the same district. That's not in our Res 6000. It's in Res
The corner of
3000.
Liberty and Loomis is
Yeah.
in a different one?
Yeah, because
Okay.
this is the line, this is the dark line here, is
Oh,
the dividing
you live
point.
on the dividing
Yeah, I
line.
do, sorry, I do, yeah.
So
Um,
without the bonuses, fewer units would be able to be built on that side of the line.
More units. To
No,
her-
without the
Fewer on her
density
side,
bonus,
without
yes,
the
on-
yes,
fewer on
right,
her side.
yeah.
Right.
Right, but more on my neighbor's side, by the way,
Right.
who has a bigger flat area now.
On the opposite
So,
side.
just because they're in Res 3000. So, that's the kind of thing that I think, to me, this whole issue of buildable area reflects a characteristic of the neighborhood. So if we have a different way that we can get to that point without, using buildable area as that criteria, then I'd be fine with doing that. It's just that somehow we need to be able, because people value the historic character of our neighborhoods, that's why they want to move here. How do we retain those characteristics while still allowing for additional infill development?
But what's the core characteristic that you're seeking to preserve? Because that's what I'm not quite understanding.
The characteristic of the neighborhood having to do with the pattern of development and the.
Specifically what?
Specifically along the streetscape. We could say, there's a certain pattern, there's a certain size, and some of those elements are reflected in other criteria, such as footprint and setback and articulation and our other architectural criteria.
Mhm.
But other elements of the building pattern that has developed over time, it's sort of like what Kirby and I were just talking about. You know, as you move through down a street, the development pattern changes.
Right.
And appropriately, what happens is that the particular district that those properties are in changes as well. But historically, what's been reflected is not what we're proposing could be built now. And I think that what we're proposing is a significant change to what has historically developed. And
I feel a little dense because I'm still not understanding either. I mean, Aaron's question is hitting at it for me because what I see as the only thing that we're giving up is regulating the number of people, and that's why I feel so. I mean, I feel like we've got all of the external regulations to ensure that buildings are near the street, facing their front doors are facing the street, that they have consistent scale massing, and I just get really concerned about saying that a certain number of people in a home reflects the character of the neighborhood, and that's what I'm.
no, I don't, yeah, and I don't think that that's, the number of family units, you might, is basically what you're saying. You're not really
Yes.
saying number of people
Right.
necessarily. And I agree that we can increase the number of family units. We can increase the number of family units in existing buildings and essentially have very little impact on the character of the neighborhood, which is what we were discussing earlier. That has minimal impact. But once we start looking at infill development, we have to be much more careful about that in terms of what's the impact. And
And
you
that's why we have all of those design standards to ensure that.
right, well, I mean, my other example was the Sibley Street. And I met every single one of the setbacks, articulation, and footprint, and still ended up with, I can't remember now, 12, 14 units. 12, yeah. And those 12 units could be built if you consider the entire property and don't exclude the 30% slope, of which there is a significant amount on that property.
So we're running out of time. Do you have one more follow-up question on that? It looks like you might have.
No, I mean,
We are out of time, actually.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna.
Thanks, Leslie.
I think first I want to know: do the commissioners want to reopen this discussion? I mean, there was a vote, there was a decision. Do we want to reopen that decision and continue this discussion at future meetings? That's the first question. The second question is, if the answer is no, how do we want to move forward with preparing a memo for city council?
and can
I
I
just
just,
want to mention both parts to that question.
guys, a point of clarification first.
Yeah.
The decision that we are looking to reconsider is specifically what?
Yes.
I think it's,
Go ahead.
Is it the 3002C change and
Yes.
the,
Which was just 3,002? I don't have the.
One
Sorry,
is buildable,
sorry,
the
it's-
C is the
buildable
buildable
area.
area one,
Okay.
yeah.
and
The
the
two-
later one is the,
Yeah, the two that
Development
Mike,
on
that Mike
slopes.
teed up at the beginning of the discussion.
So the decision was to recommend to city council that we eliminate the
That's,
buildable area,
okay, so,
so the density calculations based on buildable area.
okay, so that's the 3002C, and then
And then,
this other,
yes,
the
and then,
the hearing threshold.
well,
is
yeah,
that-
and then
That-
we would allow
Okay.
for some buildings on slopes.
Okay,
But requiring
With-
engineering
But requiring
Engineering
and
Yeah.
design review board.
okay.
hearing.
Development,
Sorry, development.
because there's a design
Right,
review.
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
there's-
Ah,
Gotta make sure.
It's, Confusing.
So that was the decision.
Yep.
And then, I asked for memos to be drafted and so that led to this, point
Okay.
in time. So, do people wanna reopen the discussion to see if there's a different substantive, solution? I know Barb does. I know she'll vote positively on that, but are others interested in that, or? The reason why I ask it like this in a formal way is because we've talked about this a lot. We've had an affirmative vote, and I think it's important that we be conscious of our time. If we've had a vote and other people don't wanna continue the discussion, then I wanna respect that and move forward, and we can draft a memo that cautions the city council of the risks of adopting this approach. I think that's a perfectly reasonable solution. But if people do wanna revisit this and have a little bit more background information, since not everybody on the commission was there for all of the public hearings leading up to the zoning adoption, then, you know, that's certainly a welcome, way to move forward too.
Another point of clarification, the vote that we took, that we,
So you weren't a part of?
that I was not a part of, does that include a requirement that we send memos to the city council?
It did not at that time.
No.
No, that's not something we needed to vote on.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think it was more, we decided as a group that it made sense to, I mean, generally speaking, when we submit recommendations to the city council, Mike usually puts together a memo and presents, here's why we've put these
Mhm.
together. In this one, we felt the need to be a little bit more involved in
Okay.
drafting of this particular recommendation. Especially since, you know, Barb's concerns are shared by others, in the public and.
That's fair.
For me, I'm not finding that I'm like moving in my like point of view on it, but I thought it was important for Barb to be able to have a platform.
Thanks.
So I'm satisfied that she's able to plead her case at this point and would probably be in favor of moving it to city council.
I'm in the same boat.
Any differing opinions?
I'm gonna abstain.
Understandable, Aaron, really.
Okay, well, hearing none, here's what I propose. I'm gonna nominate Kirby to try to interweave these memos a little bit, and the points of view. And then
Okay.
to get Barb and Mike to review and sign off on that. Is that,
Okay, yeah,
you're
that sounds
being
good.
voluntold to
We,
do that?
we use both semi-electronic versions of your memos. I mean, I probably already have them, but the latest electronic version of your memo.
You
Word
do
document.
have it.
But it's in Word, he can actually take.
Yeah.
take it.
I have a Word version of it?
Yeah, you
in
should
my
have a
email?
Word version of
Okay.
it, yeah.
Yeah, and
I'll
I'll
find-
check.
I'll
I don't
find the
know if I
latest
sent
one you sent
PDFs
me.
or Words.
And then, Kirby, do you think that you could do that so that we could discuss it at the January 14th meeting?
Yeah, it's a month
A little
away.
something to do over the holidays, Kirby.
And if not, we can move it back, but just,
Yeah.
just to give us kind
Yeah,
of goalposts
Yep.
here.
Yeah.
Okay, and
Oh,
then
thank you.
Barbara, I also wanna mention that you have said that different members of the public have concerns. They should absolutely submit their comments or come in and provide them
Mhm.
verbally, because maybe there is something in the nuance. Maybe they'll say it in a way that is, I'll
Well, I
understand it
don't,
differently.
you know, based on what they've said to me, you know, I think that
we've captured everything.
you've captured everything,
Okay.
right, yeah.
So one clarification, we've got the landscaping moving forward, so that can get fixed.
Yes.
If this is waiting till January, it's gonna miss the window for the adoption of that one. Did we want to, is the, excluding the buildable areas piece, I mean, cause, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's the buildable areas piece that's really your concern. We could move forward the other piece that goes through on the table, adjusting the table to say you can build over 30% with a hearing and engineering.
And flipping those there was something
And
about
flipping the tables, yeah,
right,
it's
yeah.
the
If you're
strikeout version.
comfortable with that, Barb, then I think
Yeah.
that
Then there's an alternative, at least I can start going up and getting that to change, and we've And if the buildable areas ends up on the long adoption list, then it ends up on the long adoption list. But that's up to you guys to decide whether you want to move buildable area forward. But I would at least go and move the engineered 30% stuff.
Yeah, if we can do that, I would.
Yeah, I mean, that would still require an engineer to be involved, but.
Yeah, and
it
we
would
have
anyway.
engineers downstairs who do our reviews. I mean, just as there's stuff downstairs right now for proposals on College Street that can't get building permits until they get approval from engineers downstairs. But
Yeah.
that would move those two forward and leave the buildable areas question as a separate item.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do I have a motion to move the staff recommendation for the steep slope part of the zoning to city council with the landscape recommendations?
The steep slope aspect of the allowing building on areas of
Yes.
30%.
Yes.
Right, because the steep slope is two parts.
Right,
Okay.
fair enough. Thank
Not,
you for
not
that
sure that was
amendment.
clarified, but anyway, yeah.
So I'll withdraw and restate the motion, the motion that I was seeking.
All right.
I've been trying to make it easy for everyone else,
Yeah.
rather than say, give me a motion,
Yeah,
and have
right,
you come
right.
up with it. Well, but Barb, do you wanna make the motion, what do you?
How about the amendments to section 3007,
Okay.
which is the steep slopes?
007. Okay, so do I have a motion to recommend to city council the staff recommendations for the revisions to 3007 steep slopes? Is that
That
accurate?
prohibited construction on slopes of 30%.
Yes.
To amend
Yeah,
that
it's just,
section.
yeah, that's, those
Yeah.
are the only changes to sections 3007. The other changes are in 3002.
Two, right.
So the only changes in 3007 are to that table that
That
prohibited.
table. Yeah, okay, and the areas, I guess I'd forgotten we did square footage area changes too.
Yeah, well, that was why,
Yeah.
just for simplicity of the motion, I said the changes that were proposed to 3007.
Okay, all right,
Then it encompassed some of those minor.
Okay, do I have such a motion?
I will move that motion.
Second?
whatever that motion was.
Second.
Okay, any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? All those abstaining? Okay, so the motion carries. That is item 6. We're gonna skip item 7. Item 8, quickly, let's look at the minutes. I just like to keep up with these.
There is, Aaron's
One Kasicki
name
wrong.
is still wrong in one
Got two of the three.
We're getting there.
I usually make these fixes, so
Okay.
I
Okay.
can.
Anything else with these? Okay,
I move we approve.
Second.
any discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay, motion carries, minutes are approved. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Moved.
Yes, sir. Second?
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for
you.
all your
Thanks for
help. This
staying
is
late.
complicated.